So
Yeah.
visual impairment is a loss of vision that impairs normal life, right? So people may have low vision, which is they may have some ability to see. They may actually be able to actually read numbers or read letters or words or a book, or they may lose that quality of vision and may only be able to see colors or shadows. There may be a loss of central or peripheral vision, and I'll explain what that means. So some people can't see to the sides. That's a loss of peripheral vision. So that's like seeing like this, like it's sort of a tunnel vision where they can see straight ahead, but they can't see to the left. They can't see anything to the side of them if they're looking straight ahead. They have to actually turn their head to see to the side. So you and I, if we put our fingers to the sides of us, we can see our fingers, but people may lose their peripheral vision, which means they're just seeing straight ahead in a tunnel. Some people actually also have a loss, or instead have a loss of central vision, which means that it's almost like putting fists in front of your eyes and you can't see straight ahead, but you can see to the sides only. And so I actually have a colleague that has that problem. He can only see out the sides, but he can't see to the front. So he utilizes his peripheral vision, which is, it's unusual, but he does have that. And some people actually also may have some patchy blindness where they actually can see out of certain areas of their eyes. Like let's say they have cataracts. Cataracts mean you have a cloudy area over your eye where you would normally see. Some people may only be able to see out of certain points, so they have to actually turn and move their head a lot to be able to see out of those pinpoints. And so those people have low vision. They have some ability to see, but they're not totally blind. The end of the spectrum then, from a small decrease in vision to a profound loss of vision, the end point then, or the worst case, is blindness, complete blindness, which means you have no functional vision at all. So technically the definition would be that you can't really see much in front of your face. It's total loss of vision. That may vary in that people may be able to see light versus dark, or they may have absolutely no light.
That people may be able to see light versus dark, or they may have absolutely no light.
So that's the range of visual impairment that you'll come across with your athletes. And so when we talk about, when we assess our athletes, it's a very important to get that context. You don't necessarily need to know their diagnosis, but you really need to you need to know what they're seeing and kind of get a feel for what their vision or what their life is like, so that you can help counsel them for their exercise.
So what is a better, so medically blind, doctor, can you hear me?
Yes.
Between blind and visual impairment, between these two terms, what term is a better term to use? From a medical perspective, what is blind, what is visual impairment?
I think definitely visual impairment is, you can visually, I would use the broad term as visual impairment to characterize anyone with any loss of vision, whether it's mild or severe. Then I would divide it into whether, so the people that have visual impairment are either they have low vision or they have blindness. So that would be an easy way to characterize the differences. So visual impairment is a broad term,
Right.
and you can divide it into low vision and complete blindness.
Low vision and complete blindness, right.
Yeah.
So, doctor, what is the assessment now as a guide? The first thing I want to know is what is the level of visual impairment. So, what is the checklist that we can use as a first call?
So before I go into that, Bhumika, I will discuss real quickly, if we have a minute or two. I didn't quite mention that there are disabilities that will be associated with the visual impairments. I think maybe we should mention it now so that we talk about it if we talk about it later. So people that have visual impairments may have other disabilities. There are actually some associations with, say, people that are autistic or have cerebral palsy. They may actually have hearing loss in addition to the visual loss, depending on how the visual loss occurred. And some people may have seizures as well. If there was trauma, there may be some mental or other physical disability. Like, let's say somebody was in an accident, they lost their vision. Well, they may actually have some disfigurement, some physical disfigurement, arms or legs, or they may have a mental disability, meaning that they have a loss of learning, loss of understanding or comprehension. Because people lose their vision, there is a tendency, especially in, let's say, a village or a place where there's a lack of resources, where there'll be an intellectual disability simply for the fact that someone is not able to learn because they don't have the proper resources for accommodation for their loss of vision. So they don't have a school that they can go to where will accommodate for their visual loss, and they just don't have a way to learn because there's no one that can teach them or have the right training to actually teach them because they don't, they have those special needs. And that kind of ties into having socioeconomic strain that, when people are in survival mode, then that person in the family that doesn't have vision may not get the attention they need to actually learn, and they may have some kind of thinking impairments. They may not know math. They may not know how to read or understand or process information properly. And so that kind of runs the gamut. That's of course, that's a preventable situation. But when you go through childhood and you're developing in those formative years from childhood through teenage years, once you lose that ability to learn, then sometimes people never catch up. So there are definitely some disabilities that will be associated, some physical, some mental, that you'll come across with the visually impaired. So that gets into that virtual assessment for visual impairments that Bhumika had just mentioned, which I can talk about now. So just keeping in mind when we do that, the visual assessment, we're also keeping in mind, hey, you know what, we have to also think, is there another physical issue or is there a mental or cognitive, meaning thinking type issue that may be associated with the visual impairment? So when you guys will counsel your athletes, and when you're doing general wellness checks for the physically abled, especially when they're visually impaired, you need to understand what their limitations are so that you can properly communicate and then properly help them. So a good way to start really with your initial communications is to do an assessment of their visual impairment. So that kind of takes into account what we just talked about the practical aspects. Do they have low vision or do they have no vision? So you can ask some simple questions. And one important um, uh, consideration that Bhumika had mentioned earlier this week, that I should mention now, is it's always a good idea for an initial question to ask, have you ever had sight? For some people that have had vision for some period of time in their life and they lost their vision, they have a much different perspective on what's around them than someone who's never seen anything at all. So people will have memories of objects, colors, spatial orientation, things like that when they have already had sight, when they've lost it, versus someone who never had sight doesn't really sometimes have that perspective to know what's around them. So asking them the simple question, have you ever had sight? And then until what age is a good first question. I have a questionnaire that we can distribute eventually and that may be online, that Bhumika can forward you guys to, but I'll review the questionnaire with you guys right now. The next question is important, is when you're doing your assessments, it's, we'll touch on this later, that it's nice to be able to do a video assessment, and you will be able to see if they have video capability, but you want to know, can they see television? Can they see cell phone screen? So you have a perspective of what they can see when you're communicating with them. You also want to ask them the central versus peripheral vision. Can you see in front of you? Can you see what's at your side? You want to ask them some other questions about what details they can see. Sometimes a good example would be, can you see faces? Can you see color? And then of course, if they're saying no to everything, then you want to know, can you see anything? Can you see light? And then another question also, sometimes we forget that many people, probably more often than not, when they have a loss of vision, it's in both eyes, but some people have good vision in one eye, or they can see unequal, which means they have better vision in one eye than the other, and it helps to know that. So you can ask them, can you see out of one eye? Can you see better out of one eye? So those are good visual screening questions to determine what is their visual impairment. Is it complete blindness or is it low vision? And if it's low vision, what can they actually see? And that gives you a lot of perspective in terms of how you can counsel them and how you can interact with them. The other good question to ask also kind of ties in both with their visual impairment as well as physical disability. You want to ask them, what do they use for their daily activities? I have a checklist actually that I include in the sheet. Do they use a guide?
So,
Go ahead.
so just to add here, Doctor, that what we are talking about it's a job aid in our terminology. We are going to call it as a job aid. So the first call that you do, and you would have already had information, because ours is an existing database of athletes that we have interacted with them in the weekly training. So we have certain information about them already. So when you are assigned as a buddy to a visual impaired, there will be some background data that will be given to you. And then in the first call, you can ask further questions, starting with introducing yourself, and then a few other things, and then the visual assessment checklist is what you can use. So there will be a link which will come to you post this training with all the checklists that you will require for your first call. So visual assessment will be one of that. So that will come to you as a mail, and whatever doctor said now verbally, that is a checklist a form which you will fill and utilize it for yourself. So
Yes.
doctor also. So once we do the visual assessment, in the same call or in the next call, I want to understand what is the general well-being of the visually impaired person that I'm talking to. So what is it that I would, without asking, going too deep, asking the right questions, what is it that I can do?
Yeah, so in the wellness check, I divided it into 5 categories, and the 5 major categories is sort of, you want to get a health and nutrition status. You want to know their physical well-being. You want to get an understanding of their mental well-being, and you want to know how connected they are in terms of their technology. And then the last topic is, an abuse screening, which I'll go over with you guys. So in terms of the first category, health, you want to know basically what their health status, which, like Bhumika had mentioned, you may know a little bit about their medical history based on the information you get. Simple questions would be, are they nutritionally, are they eating 3 meals a day? And are they drinking, do they have good, safe drinking water? And then are they actually able to access and drink the water on a consistent basis? If they're taking medications, do they have their medications? Especially now with the coronavirus, people have been displaced. They may be in places where they don't have access to what they used to before they were displaced from their home. And if they're not working or something, they may not be able to have access to these things. So these are good screening questions. So you want to know if they're taking medications, do they have them? Also, any health concerns that they may have at the present time. Are they having pain or any health issues? Because they may not have been able to communicate that to anybody before. So it's a good intervention. In terms of the coronavirus, it also, you want to make sure, especially now in India, is a critical time. I think that because the lockdown is over, there's going to be some issues in terms of coronavirus transmission. So there's it's a great time to actually ask them in their well-being, do they have a mask? Do they have gloves? Do they have sanitizer and soap? And you want to make sure that they do. That's going to be critical, actually, moving forward, just with what's going to happen in the next few months in India. Moving on to the physical well-being, you want to make sure that they have a safe and secure place to live. So you ask them, where are you living? Who are you living with? Is it a stable situation, or are you only there temporarily? You want to know what their access is to basic necessities. Are they able to get the daily supplies they need? Do they have a place to bathe? In terms of food security, you ask them about the meals a day, but you also want to know, are they worried about getting food or water? There may be that they have limited resources or limited supplies. It's a good idea also at this time to ask them if they're employed or if they're in school. At this time, the employment question is a good segue, that if they are having any financial distress, they may mention it to you without you having to ask them specifically. Similarly, you want to know you know, especially if they have been displaced or moved to a different, or if they've gone back to, say, a village or their hometown or their native, you want to ask them, do you feel safe where you are at the present moment? Because that's important. So those get into some of the abuse screening, which I'll get to. The next category in terms of wellness is the mental well-being. So you do want to know. Oh, you know what? Actually, before that, I did want to mention, especially when you're doing the visual check for the tying into the well-being, you want to know if they're able to get around. And so, are they? How do they get around? Do they use transportation? Do they walk? Do they have a family member who takes them places? Are they on their own usually? Do they take an auto, or do they have access to taxi, rideshare like Uber, Ola, or are they taking the bus? That's also important because you can tell what their level of confinement is, and that kind of goes along with the well check as well. Now, moving on to the mental well-being, mood and stability is very important and sometimes overlooked. And so it's a really good intervention for you guys to be able to ask a simple question: Are you happy? Are you doing okay? How is your mood? And then you can ask some specific questions that are very revealing. You can ask them, have you been crying? Because they may feel that they're starting to get depressed or they have other concerns, and that kind of is a good screening question to understand their level of stability in their situation. You can also ask, do you feel scared or fearful? They may not be in a safe place, or there may be some concerns for abuse. And you can ask them, are you worried in general? And that might be that they just kind of worried about the coronavirus, or they may have some health concerns, or they may have financial concerns, and that gives them a chance to open up and communicate with you. All of those could be indicative of abuse. So if you get the feeling that there's an abuse issue, then there are some screening questions that you should ask. Number one, do you feel that you can ask them straight up, are you in a safe place right now, do you feel like, or do you feel unsafe where you are? Are people treating you okay or not? Do you feel like people are making you ashamed or sad? There are some cultural variations or some stigma, and then some, you know, superstition or cultural beliefs sometimes, that when people end up back in a home situation or they're with unfamiliar people, they may be made to feel ashamed or sad. And then the other question, of course, same situation, is are they concerned about being hit or forced to do things that they don't want to do? Unfortunately, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse are all factors that have to be that can't be ignored. And these are ways that you may find these things out without having to probe too much. So that pretty much covers the well buddy check. I think the next question Bhumika was going to ask. Did you have another question, Bhumika, about this?
Yeah, so doctor, so when we are saying a wellness check, so we are going to cover the health related questions and physical well-being, mental well-being.
Oh.
And there will also be nutrition questions, right? And abuse.
Yes, I forgot there's one more section. So the connection, actually. So the other question to ask basically also is, you want to make sure that you have a line of communication with them. And so you can ask them, what kind of phone do they use, cell phone or landline? You can ask them, is their cell phone still in use? You want to ask also, do they have a computer? You know, this is for their work or education. And then also, do they have internet access? That might give you an idea if they're not able to pay their cable bill, they're having financial concerns, or they just don't have access, or they may lose the way to communicate with you. And so it's a good idea to be able to make sure that you have some line of access with them, just in case that does happen. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, so just to summarize, we've discussed 5 major categories for wellness check, and that is the health check. You have the physical well-being, mental well-being, connections or communication, and abuse screening questions. So these are the 5 broad categories that doctor has covered right now. And doctor, what is the frequency of this wellness check that we should be doing? So, how many times should we call in a month?
That's a good question. I feel like, you know, first of all, for the phone buddies that are on right now, it's going to really be up to you guys on how often you're able to give them a call. But I think preferably weekly is a good way to do dispositional checks, wellness checks. I think that especially now that we're in a situation where there's been a lockdown and people have been moved from places where they live and there's some instability, I think weekly is a good place to start. Now, you can make adjustments based on the level of functioning. If someone is confined, they don't have a way to get around, things may change for them over time and they may run out of resources. So you may have to check on them. You may have to adjust your frequency of follow-ups. And then on the other hand, some people may be very, very functional. They may be in a really good situation. You may feel like you don't have to communicate as often, or it may seem redundant. And so then you can make adjustments accordingly. But I think weekly is a good place to start. That may end up tying in with when people start to exercise, that when you call them for exercise, you can kind of combine the two and ask quick questions in those 5 categories and then move on to their exercise checkups. But I think for now that people are sort of in a situation where they're just sort of staying put, that weekly checks will be really good. Now, that brings to mind that when you do that initial check, that there may be some red flag answers that they give. So if there are answers that concern you, then that requires immediate dispositioning. Some of that so let's say that somebody raises an issue where there's some insecurity. They may have some financial distress, or they may not be sure about where they're going to be living or where they're going to get their food from. That might be an example of a situation where you'll have to get in contact with them sooner than later. And you may have to decide, do I just observe and call them frequently, or do I have to alert some authoritative, how do you say, some the
local bodies
Yeah.
which are dealing with this kind of emergency situations,
Correct.
like the disaster management, human rights. We also have several social groups which help with these red flags that we identify. So what's important, as doctor said, that if we have red flags identified when we're doing health the wellness check, we're going to discuss it back with the guide team, with the leads for the guides, and then we're going to identify who will take up those tasks and whether you will be doing it or whether you hand it over to the other teams which specialize in this area. So yeah, so the frequency of calling and checking would vary depending on how many red flags have been identified on case-by-case basis.
Yeah, so basically, if there's a catastrophic problem, no food, abuse, lack of home, no home or shelter, those are things that you would immediately contact some resource or authority, or contact your supervising buddy if you're not sure what to do. If there's something impending where there's some insecurity, but there's no distress or emergency, then you may choose to observe. But any time that you're not sure about what to do, you should always contact your supervisor or your lead locally and make sure that you're communicating well, so that you don't ignore a situation or neglect to do something just because you're unsure. So whenever you're uncertain, make sure you contact your lead. And then in the worst case scenario where you think that there's something going on, it always is a good idea to contact some local resource or authority to make sure that someone gets the attention they need.
Right. So, doctor, moving on to the next thing to discuss. If we find that the visually impaired person assigned to me is in a generally a good state of well-being, so we can move on to the physical workouts for fitness. So, what is the physical the assessment that we will do? Exercise assessment.
So I think the first exercise assessment that's important is to get an understanding of what their exercise experience is and what their nutritional status is. Basically, your goal is to understand if they are really ready for exercise, and then how much, what's the dose and frequency of that exercise. I think a great first question is get an idea of their nutritional status, because that's going to be the one that's going to be able to support their exercise. If they're not eating well, if they don't have access to fluids, then definitely they're going to have to be very conservative or not exercise. So not only just for generally getting meals, but you want to know, again, are they getting their 3 meals a day? Are they drinking enough water? and then how much fruits and vegetables are they eating. That's going to be the foundation of a healthy diet that will support exercise. So based on the way that you ask those 3 questions, how many meals per day, how much water do they drink, and are they eating fruits and vegetables, you'll get an understanding of whether they know or they're aware that they should be eating 3 meals a day, they should be drinking water, and they should be eating fruits and vegetables, and you'll get an understanding of how much they're doing of each thing. Basically, then from there, you can give some quick advice on, hey, you know what, you really need to eat 3 meals a day. A lot of people skip breakfast, so you emphasize the importance of breakfast. You want to also make a general recommendation to eat at least 1 fruit or vegetable with every meal. And if you're hungry, get a snack, try to get a fruit or a veggie as a snack. And then also the quality of the meals. You want to emphasize both two broad categories of nutrition, which would be energy-based foods like rice, dal, breads, and then also protein-based foods like milk, meat, paneer, maybe millet. I think dal has some protein as well. And so you do want to emphasize that they are eating those sorts of things. So that's a good way to actually make the assessment for exercise and also give some quick advice. In terms of their general health assessment, you do want to know that they're starting with a body that's ready for exercise. You want to ask them, hey, are you having aches and pains when you do move around? Are you having any problems with your arms, your legs, or your spine? And if they don't, then that means they're probably okay. But if they do, then you want to know, is there a physical disability that's in addition to their visual impairment, and is there some accommodation you have to make in terms of what you recommend for exercise, whether it's going to be very, very basic, just stretching, or they're going to get into their walking or running. In terms of their physical fitness and running experience, you want to know, have they participated in an event before, which tells you they have done some training, and that makes it a lot easier. And you want to also know, are they exercising now? Are they reasonably fit, or are they really starting from scratch? You can ask them some screening questions like, have you ever exercised regularly? Do you need a guide for walking? Do you walk with a cane, crutches, walker, wheelchair? Do you walk with a walking stick? Do you use a cane, crutches, walker, wheelchair? Those will give you a baseline idea of whether they should be running, walking, or doing very basic activities. The other thing then is understanding what their running resources will be. So there's a couple of categories. You want to ask them, where would they plan to do their walking or running sessions? Is there a safe place for them to actually run or walk safely? Or are they going to be confined to the home where they'll just be doing home-based aerobic exercise? And also, do you want to know, do they presently have a guide or someone supervising them in that safe area? Because that's going to be important, that even if they have some vision that they feel like they can see, it's good to have a supervisor, but for many, or if not most of the athletes, they will need to have a guide. And so you want to know what the resources are. And then the other running resource is, do they have exercise shoes? They may be just a naturally barefoot walker or runner, which I guess would be okay, but preferably it's good, I think, to have some sort of exercise shoes. So you want to know what they have. Do they have shoes or some sort of foot cover, or do they need exercise shoes? So based on that exercise assessment, you can tell, do you feel like they're ready to run, ready to walk? Do they need shoes? And then what kind of a guide do you think they're going to need? And that kind of ties in with that initial visual assessment, visual impairment assessment, that probably with the combination of the two, you'll get a good feel for what, if they need a guide, which they probably will, and then what kind of guide. The things that you want to be able to help to counsel, even virtually, is will the athlete need just a spotter? And what that means is, a spotter is a non-contact guide who will be side by side without touching the athlete, but will tell them there's something on the road, there's a curb, we're turning, there's a puddle, step down, jump over, things like that. Otherwise, guides will be either, you guys will probably know this if you've done any sort of volunteering with the runners, that people are either arm in arm or use some sort of a tether, or they hold hands, or they hold the guide's, or the athlete will hold the guide's elbow, things like that. And so that's a good way to get enough information to make some basic recommendations on what they should be doing for exercise. Hold on one second, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Anyway, so that's a good. This is a good way to get enough information to do the basic assessment of the for exercise.
So
Yeah.
so whatever you have mentioned, this is again a checklist that will be given to the phone buddy guides, and they will go based on the checklist and do the initial call, getting this kind of data in place, right? So what about the physical screening? What kind of assessment can we do?
So the physical screen will complete that workup, the evaluation of the walker or runner. And so this will actually, now you go from understanding what the athlete is capable of doing to actually making some formal recommendations on what the dose and frequency of their exercise would be. So here, just give me 1 second here. The
And
okay.
this can be done on the phone. Additionally, we can use a video like a WebEx call or a Zoom call.
So it's very, I think it's good to make the distinction or determine, I'm sorry, am I interrupting you, Bhumika?
Yeah, I was just saying that physical screen can be done with the phone or with by doing a video call if you're going to be doing it virtually. So how does it vary if you're doing just a phone call, and how does it vary if you are using a video call or a FaceTime?
So the video is much better than the phone call. With the video, you get good context in terms of what your athlete looks like. You can tell if they have any physical disability. You can tell how they actually move around. So you get much better perspective on what the athlete's capabilities are. If you do a phone screen, you're very limited because you're actually going to be depending on what the athlete tells you when you ask them to do a few physical tests. So if you do a phone screen,
we do this screening, Doctor. So when we do this physical screen, we've got it's better we have the video on, even if the person on the other side cannot see.
Correct.
I mean, it's 100% visually.
Correct.
Okay.
When you're doing that first visual assessment, you'll be able to understand whether or not you'll be able to do a phone or video screen. At that time, you can try to see if there's someone at home that will be able to assist with at least putting the video on, even though the athletes cannot see, at least that you'll be able to see them. So the video is very, very important as opposed to the phone. So much more preferred if possible. So the goals for the physical check are to be able to decide whether they can run or walk, how fit they are, what their physical disabilities may be, and then you can give them some injury prevention exercises to kind of supplement their running or walking. So I just gave 3 basic recommendations for the screening tests. So if you have the video, what you can do is you can have them just jog in, or first do like a walking and running in place. So the first thing would be that ask them to march in place for 10 seconds and see if they're coordinated and balanced. If they look coordinated and balanced when they're marching, then you can move on to having them jog in place for 10 seconds and then look to see if they're coordinated and balanced. And then you can also check to see, wow, do they get fatigued? Do they look like they're stable or unstable? Are they kind of all over the place? And based on that, you can make an assessment. This athlete looks like they're ready for jogging, or maybe they should just walk. Some people will just cruise right through that. And it doesn't have to be 10 seconds. It can be 30 seconds if you need more time maybe to see what their endurance is like. But marching in place and jogging in place is a great first screening test. The second good screening test is to do a single leg screen. Just ask them to balance on one leg and then switch to the other leg and ask them to balance for 10 seconds and see how they look. If they're able to hold their position without breaking, which means putting their foot down on the ground, that's a good sign that their core stability and what's called proprioception, which means their ability to kind of keep their balance when they're under strain, is good. And the other thing you want to know is, are they balanced upright or are they actually stooping forward? And so if they're balanced well, if they can hold without a break, that means that their core stability and their balance is good. And so you can give them some recommendations for some advanced exercises. So basically, there's two categories of exercises. So if you find that when they're standing on one leg, it doesn't look good, they're not well balanced, then you can start with a clamshell exercise. If they do look really well balanced, then you can give them a side lying leg raise, which is a more advanced exercise for the core. So two different types of core exercise, one beginner, one intermediate. With those, you always want to tell them, hey, you know what? Try to do a single leg balance and try to balance for 30 seconds. So two basic exercises, one core exercise, which is either the leg raise or the clamshell. And then the second exercise is the stand and balance on one leg. You always want to tell them when they're doing that exercise to stand near something stationary, like a stairwell or a table, or have a guide or stand in a doorway so they can hold on to something if they lose their balance and they don't fall. The clamshell and side-lying leg raise, I believe, are on Bhumika's website that you can see and you can counsel on those exercises. And if you have questions, we can also clarify those. The third exercise is the bridge exercise. And so the bridge exercise is a ground exercise where they lay on their back and they get into a bridge position. And this is actually pretty easy to make an assessment over video. This is another core exercise which is very important for walkers and runners. And basically you ask the athlete to get into a bridge position, you try to describe it to them the best you can and see if they can hold it for 30 seconds. If you're unable to describe it, they don't get it, then it's okay. But it's, there are ways to kind of verbally describe the exercise, the bridge exercise. First thing is, you guys, if you don't know how to do it yourselves, learn it yourself, and then you can figure out how to describe it to the athlete. So basically, you want to know if they're able to hold the bridge straight and get in a good position, and are they able to hold it for 30 seconds. If they can't hold the bridge at all, then you just ask them to get in a bridge position and back down and do repeats, maybe 10 repeats, and then that would be a good exercise. If they're really pretty good, they can hold it for 30 seconds. Then to ask them to challenge themselves to try to hold the bridge position for 60 seconds. And so this is another exercise that we should be able to provide for you on the website, so that through a handout, so you can learn the exercise yourself and then be able to give the recommendation. So it's very simple. 3 good screening tests, one to assess that whether they can walk or run, one to test their balance and their basic core stability, and then another one to check another area of their core stability that's very important for runners. If you don't have video and you just have to do it by phone, then you can ask them the questions. Are you able to march for 10 seconds? Can you jog in place for 10 seconds? Or, when you're doing the march and jog, they're doing it just in place, right? Standing stationary. So you can ask them, can you stand on one leg for 10 seconds? How did it feel? Did it feel easy? Did it feel difficult? You're relying on them to tell you over the phone, but it's better than nothing, I suppose. And then you can ask them, can you march for 10 seconds? Can you jog for 10 seconds? Which felt better? Which felt more comfortable? You can also ask them, do you feel more comfortable walking or do you feel more comfortable jogging? And then the other screening question that you can ask them on a phone, by phone, is, can you walk like a duck? If they understand what that means they will actually crouch down and walk in a squat position. And you can ask them, was it easy? Was it difficult? But the phone is very difficult to make the assessment, but at least those are a few questions you can ask them just to get a feel for where they are. And based on the screening, then, you can make recommendations on their exercise. So number one, you can decide based on what you see, what you hear from the patient, from the athlete, can they walk or can they run? And you can start to counsel them and say, you know what, you should start walking, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes. Or maybe they can start running with a guide if they have a safe place to run. Also, you want to emphasize the whole training session, meaning that they do a warm-up, they do an exercise session, and they do a cool down.